CBS News chief political analyst John Dickerson. John, good morning.
Morning, Anthony.
We heard Ed O'Keefe say that the White House is signaling they don't expect major developments out of this. But this is a relationship, the U.S. and Russia, that's been spiraling downward for a while now, both sides saying it's at a low point. Is there a possibility of stabilizing the relationship at least?
Well, that's the really important thing, is stability. 58 years ago, almost to the day, U.S. officials and Russian officials met in Geneva to work out the hotline with the red phone. It wasn't an actual red phone, but why did they do it? For two reasons. One was communication. They needed to be able for adversaries to exchange messages quickly so there were no misunderstandings. That's the second thing, as Nora was talking about cyber attacks.
Yeah.
The U.S. has to be sure and Russia has to be sure exactly what the red lines are on these cyber attacks so that something doesn't spiral out of control. That's stability among adversaries, but that's important. So they could work out some of that. And then there are these nuclear issues, these prisoner issues. There's obviously Ukraine. There are a whole host of issues where the U.S. wants to say, here are our priorities.
Right.
And that's really important for the Russians to know what U.S. priorities are, what the red lines are, and then also to know what the Russians might do to get back in the U.S.'s good graces and vice versa.
Joe Biden is a new president, but these two men have a prior relationship. There is a history. It is interesting to note, I think, the wording that Joe Biden has used about Mr. Putin. I mean, at one time, of course, not long ago, he called him a killer. But then he just said recently they called him a worthy adversary, which seemed to be a tonal shift.
Sure. And you see, so President Biden is playing games. You could imagine President Putin, who likes to play games in these meetings, extending the length of the meeting. In other words, he likes to show his physical prowess. He's going to do an Iron Man maybe approach to today, stretch it out. There will be a lot of gamesmanship. But I thought worthy adversary was quite interesting, too, because the president's been criticized for giving Putin a meeting as if it's some kind of prize. Well, and to be called a worthy adversary by an American president for Putin, who wants to look on parity with an American president, is a kind of gift in advance of this.
A form of respect in some ways.
Exactly, which means when they get behind closed doors, you would expect perhaps the president to say, look, I've shown you respect there. Here are the things you need to hear me on in this private way. Sort of playing an inside game and an outside game.
There is a meeting going on, but there are parameters for the meeting as we understand it. The men will be together for hours along with staff, but no meal will be shared. They will never be alone together. And then afterwards, there will be no joint press conference. That's a lot of choreography. Why?
It is. Well, and think about the last time that a president met with Vladimir Putin. When President Trump met with him, it was the exact opposite. It was unscripted. It was harem scarum. It was not as tightly controlled. And the reason it has to be tightly controlled, again, is to make sure there are no misunderstandings, that both sides need to know exactly what they're saying to each other. And that's about the moment, but it's also for 6 months from now, so that when Vladimir Putin is making choices about what he's going to do, he can have in his mind the recollection of what they said in those meetings. And the same is true for President Biden as well. And so it has to be choreographed so that there's no misunderstanding, because inside the misunderstanding is where you have things go wrong.
Now, President Biden has been on quite the tour of Europe. What is the significance, you think, of this coming on the heels of the G7 and NATO, where a unified front was presented?
So President Biden keeps saying, and all the staff keeps saying, America is back. What does that mean? It means that the president is putting himself forward as the lead spokesman for a whole set of values that basically established the liberal order in international relations over the last 70, 80 years. So it's not just U.S.-Russia relations. It's President Biden saying, I am here as the representative of the most powerful democracy on the planet, and here's what we believe. And these aren't just abstract notions. I have countries behind me. I have the NATO alliance behind me, and that gives force to what I say. That is both a public message, but is also private. I mean, when I asked Dr. Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State, how to measure this, she said, don't look at the pageantry. Watch 6 months later if the private messages have paid off. What would we look for? Fewer cyber attacks, maybe some improvement on the human rights front. But those private messages are going to be the most interesting, and unfortunately, we won't learn about those for about 6 months or so.
John, we're looking, as you're speaking, at President Biden's motorcade on its way to the meeting with President Putin. How successful has President Biden been so far, do you think, on this trip? And what constitutes success in this meeting with Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. We'll start with Putin. As I was saying about former Secretary Rice, her point was success is if he can convey in these private meetings, this is what is important in the United States, and this is what we know you're up to. President Biden can talk about intelligence and about what the U.S. really knows the Russians are up to, and can say, if you keep going down this road, here is the retaliation you can expect. Again, predictability, because in misunderstanding, you can have a real, particularly with cyber, it can go haywire fast. So unfortunately, a lot of that we won't be able to measure in the moment, and we might not be able to measure for months.
Part of evaluating the president's performance will be, what did Vladimir Putin get out of this? So what does Putin hope to bring home to Russia? Politically, what does he need to do or want to do here?
Well, he's already brought it home, which is being called a worthy adversary, as Anthony mentioned, by the U.S. president. He wants to look like, he wants to be able to say, look, I can meddle in Ukraine, I can imprison my political opponents, and I pay no penalty for it. So strength works. Now, the White House knows that. They know they're giving him that little bit. But what they've made the calculation is it's worth giving Putin that, because what we want is clarity, and we want him to stop behaving in the way he is. And the only way we can get a shot at doing that is if we deliver these messages privately to him.
But doesn't Putin still need the United States for his home audience to say, look, there's the big enemy out there. They're enemy number one. I've kept you safe. Keep me in power for another decade.
Sure. He one foot on the gas, one foot on the brake. So he'll say, they're the big enemy out there. I am the only one who can stand up to them. But when I do, I get this parity. I get called a worthy adversary. And so he can show some of those bouquets that he's gotten, and so in that sense, he wants to look like he is chummy with the American president. That's chummy goes too far, but looks like he can
he's close.
Be at least on the same level with an American president, which is one that allows him to show, look, I can do both things for you, the Russian people.
So all of this is happening as Alexei Navalny is in prison in Russia. How does that play into this, especially with Putin kind of dismissing the issue when he was asked in an interview about Navalny recently?
Well, this goes back to, and this is perhaps the trickiest part for President Biden, and it goes back to what he's been doing for the last several days, which is say, I am the leader of the democracies, and we care about human rights. Fine, so he talks about that. But what is it going to do? How is it going to pay off? And if you keep talking about human rights and don't put any muscle behind it, or it doesn't pay off, then it weakens that message. So in terms of that public role as the leader of a democracy, Navalny's case and what the president says about it and whether it pays off in any particular way is very important for the sort of public theatrical part of this diplomacy. We've talked about the private messages, but in a very public way, a U.S. president who puts the hammer down on human rights has to have some kind of a payoff, and it'll be fascinating to see how that goes.
John, quickly, if you're President Biden, what stick do you have to hold over Vladimir Putin to say, stop with the cyber warfare, stop meddling in U.S. elections?
I think we know where you live, which is we can look into exactly what these Russian hackers are doing, why they're related to you, and we know you have companies, and I mean, you could imagine all the way into your gas pipelines. We know how to turn them on and we know how to turn them off, and if you don't stop, you're going to start having lots of little accidents in Russia that you don't know the origin of. I mean, I'm making this up, but this is the kind of private threat that a president can send that we won't hear about, but that could convey a strong message.
All right, John Dickerson, thank you so much.